Well, church, it's the 25th. 1 month. One month, right? And you know, it's true. Like it's this time that's this mixture of kind of busyness and running around, but also it's this time of beautiful worship. It's one of the most beautiful times of year for our faith. And so I hope that you can find time and find space to enter into worshiping Jesus this Christmas season. How many people are traveling for Christmas? Okay. How many people are flying for Christmas? Okay, we got a few. How many people are happy with the price of their flight? Not a lot, right? It's crazy. It's crazy out there. I was talking with someone, this past week, and the flights are like double what they would normally cost because, the airline knows. The airline knows that you want to get home for Christmas, and everyone wants to be home on the 25th, but you're also scheduling around your work schedule. Maybe you've got a very tight window, and then you're also trying to coordinate with your extended family and what's working out for them and their celebrations, and so you don't kind of have the luxury of, choosing this flight or that. You kind of got to take the flight that you can get, right? And so it can wind up costing two or more times what it normally would have cost because the airline knows that seat on that airplane is worth what someone will pay for it. And the truth is, that's true of lots of things, that things are worth what people will pay for them. And really when we're talking about worth, we're talking about priorities. And so, if it's Christmas time, maybe being with your family suddenly becomes a higher priority than, having $1,000 or $2,000 or whatever it is. That's true of everything. That's kind of how things are valued in this world. Things are worth what people will pay for them. And when we're talking about worth, we're really talking about priorities. If you've purchased property in this housing market, you know that, right? And things are worth what people will pay for it. And so someone, people will decide having that one-bedroom condo, ground level, no view, is a higher priority than having $500,000, right? That's more stressful than Christmas. We're constantly making these value calculations, these priority calculations, right? That's kind of how we run our lives. Like the reason you're here today is because there was something about being here that was a higher priority than, sleeping in and getting brunch. Things are worth what people will pay for them, and when we talk about worth, we're really talking about priorities. What's Jesus worth? Have you ever thought about that? Maybe you haven't. What is Jesus worth? You probably don't think about it consciously, but it's a question that we actually answer in 100 different ways throughout our day. And it's a question that we're going to see a few people wrestle with in our passage for today. What is Jesus worth? And so we're continuing our God Among Us sermon series. We're working through the Gospel of John, which is one of the 4 biographies of Jesus in the Bible, the Gospels. And today we're starting chapter 12, which is an important moment in the story, actually. And so take a look at verse 1. It says, 6 days before the Passover celebration began. That's important, and we can't miss it. 6 days before the Passover celebration began. We talked a couple of weeks ago about how the Gospel of John basically has 2 big and quite distinct sections to it. And scholars have named the first half, the first section, the book of signs. Okay, do better on the second one. They've called the second half the book of... Oh, that was way worse. Book of glory. They're called the book of signs and the book of glory. The book of signs is all about, it's a highlight reel of Jesus' 3-year public ministry, and it's kind of structured around signs or miracles that Jesus did. And then the second half, the book of glory, it slows right down, and it's this slow motion, detailed description of the last week of Jesus' life. Sometimes it's called Holy Week, leading up to his crucifixion. Now, we know that Jesus gets crucified on Passover. So when John says 6 days before Passover, we know that the story is taking a turn. We're entering into Holy Week, and we're entering into that second half, the book of glory. Technically, the real hinge point is the end of chapter 12, but even here at the beginning of chapter 12, John is already signaling it. And so the whole second half of the book is going to be all about Holy Week, and we're starting that today. And then we're going to leave it over Advent, and then we'll come back to it in January. So this is an important moment. We're kicking off Holy Week, a week that ends with the crucifixion. It says 6 days before the Passover celebration, Jesus arrived in Bethany, the home of Lazarus, the man he had raised from the dead. A dinner was prepared in Jesus' honor. Martha served, and Lazarus was among those who ate with him. So Passover is coming up, which is a key Jewish holiday, and the tradition was that Jewish men, if at all possible, were supposed to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover in Jerusalem. And so Jerusalem would have been packed with just literally thousands of extra people. Okay? And so finding lodging for Jesus and his 12 disciples would be challenging, not unlike flying at Christmas. And so there's this town, Bethany, which is just a few miles down the road. And so Jesus goes there first. He's got friends in Bethany, and so he goes there first rather than trying to go like right into the downtown Jerusalem. Jesus has friends in Bethany, and the friends, we've already met them. It's Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. They're this group of siblings, and we met them in chapter 11 in a story that was actually the climax of the book of signs. It was Jesus' greatest sign, his greatest miracle. Lazarus had got sick and died. He was dead and buried. Jesus walked up, and he, with a word, brought Lazarus back to life, and Lazarus came out of his grave. It's this amazing story, okay? It's the climax of the first half of John. That would have been at most a few weeks before this story. Okay, so they're still kind of in awe at this thing that just happened, this miracle that just happened. And so naturally, when Jesus comes back into town, they want to honor Jesus, and so they throw a party. They have a gathering, a dinner gathering in Jesus' honor. And that's kind of the setting for this story. And what happens in this story is kind of all the people involved are going to kind of tip their hand. They're all going to indicate what they think Jesus is worth. Let's take a look. First up is Mary. Verse 3 tells us, "Then Mary took a 12-ounce jar of expensive perfume made from essence of nard, and she anointed Jesus' feet with it, wiping his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance." So, what's nard? Besides being a goofy word. The full name of nard is Andrew Bernard. That's an Office reference. The full name of nard is actually spikenard, which maybe is an even goofier word. Spikenard, and it's an essential oil. So if you're looking for something to diffuse, you can pick up some spikenard, and they still have it today. And there are apparently some pretty serious and wide-ranging health benefits, according to a website I found that looked very questionable. So it's this essential oil. It's derived from this plant that grows in the Himalayas, okay, in northern India in the Himalayas. And so picture, this is the ancient Near East, okay. Picture an oil that's distilled from flowers in the Himalayas and then has to come by donkey 5,000 kilometers to Jerusalem. This is serious stuff. This is expensive stuff. And so Judas in verse 5 says, this is worth like a year's salary. What he says in Greek is 300 denarii, and a denarius was 1 day's wages. So it's worth a year's salary for this amount. It's 12 ounces. In Greek, it's a litra, which was the Roman measurement. A litra was about 12 ounces. There's actually historical evidence that in this time you could buy a litra of spikenard perfume for 100 denarii, which means that Mary got the good stuff. Okay? In fact, it says it's made from essence of nard. That phrase there, what it's really saying is pure, unadulterated. Okay, this is the good stuff. There's no additives. It's not cut with another oil. There's no fillers. So, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were probably a little bit of a family of means. But regardless, Mary makes sure that she brings the very best for Jesus. This is good stuff. This is expensive perfume. She pours it on Jesus' feet. Now, Mark tells this story as well, and in Mark's version, Mark chapter 14, he says she pours the perfume on Jesus' head. It's a difference between the two. When you think about it, though, 12 ounces, like, people still use essential oils, right? And you use, like, drops at a time. 12 ounces, that's a pop can. So that amount of this stuff would have been way too much for Jesus' feet or his head. And so what's more likely is that she poured this stuff all over Jesus' body. And Mark mentions the head, and John mentions the feet. Mark mentions the head because he's trying to set up this idea that Jesus is a king, and kings were anointed on their head with oil. Aha, so he's evoking that image. John emphasizes the feet because he's about to tell a story in chapter 13 where Jesus washes his disciples' feet at another dinner gathering because no one else would wash feet, and so he's setting up actually a contrast. So John emphasizes the feet, Mark emphasizes the head, but what probably happened with 12 ounces of this stuff is she poured this stuff all over Jesus. Now, if I walked up to you with a pop can's worth of an essential oil and poured it all over you, you might not be that thrilled, right? What are you doing? That's because in modern day Canada, most of us have our odor management figured out, right? Remember, we're in the ancient Near East, okay? This was not a place that smelled good. Most people owned one set of clothing. You're not changing every day, you're not bathing every day, you're not washing it that much. It's hot, right? And so there's this mixture of sweat and dust that's always, all over your clothes. Okay? There's no dental hygiene, there's no breath mints, there's no deodorant. People traveled on dirt roads wearing sandals. In the city, people emptied their chamber pots out the window into the street. This was a bad smelling place. And so in the ancient world, to smell inoffensive was a luxury, let alone to smell beautiful. Okay? You get what I'm saying? And so it would have been this incredible luxury and honor for Jesus to be perfumed with this stuff in a world where everything stinks. So she pours this oil on Jesus, and she wipes it with her hair. And you need to know that in that culture, women did not let down their hair in public. In fact, a married woman, only her husband was supposed to see her hair. If another man saw her hair, that was taken as a sign of loose morals. So on this verse, actually, Ray Bystrom, who's an MB scholar, he writes that this is a, quote, very improper and potentially erotic act, End quote. This is why it's scandalous. Okay, it's scandalous. Jesus doesn't receive it as an erotic act, but to the room full of people who are watching this unfold, it would have had that sort of like, that jarring, shocking connotation to it. Okay, so think about some of the ways that people show devotion today. Like music fans will throw their underwear on stage. Okay, hockey fans will show up to a game with their belly painted with the colors of their team. People will tattoo the Nike or Harley Davidson logo on their bodies. Star Wars or Harry Potter fans will show up at the theater dressed as their favorite character. And the idea is that their feelings for this franchise, this person, whatever, their feelings are so strong that they can't be expressed with normal behavior. They can only be expressed with extreme behavior. They can't be contained with sort of what's socially acceptable. That's what's going on here. What Mary does here is outrageous. We've talked a bit a few weeks ago about how Mary seems to be a woman who feels things deeply. How in Luke chapter 10, there's another story of Mary, Martha, and Jesus. And Jesus is at their house, and Martha does what's expected of her. She's in the kitchen making food and making sure everyone's got what they need. And Mary goes in the living room and sits down at Jesus' feet while he teaches. She leaves her sister with no help. She completely disregards the gender expectations of her day. Mary's a woman, in other words, whose devotion to Jesus runs so deep that she doesn't care what people think. So Mary comes to Jesus, and what she brings is costly, scandalous worship. Okay, it's costly, 300 denarii, a year's wages. And it's scandalous. She lets down her hair. She wipes his feet with her hair. It's uninhibited, it's controversial. And she does it in front of a dining room full of people. That's Mary. Then Judas responds. Verse 4 and 5, but Judas Iscariot, the disciple who would soon betray him, said, that perfume was worth a year's wages. It should have been sold and the money given to the poor. Can we just stop there and say that concern is a valid concern? Okay, if someone came to the church and said, I'm going to donate $50,000 worth of perfume, we would have a conversation. Okay, look, that's great, but we could do a lot of good in this world with... It's a valid concern. The problem, of course, for Judas is it's tainted with greed, right? John tells us in verse 6, not that he cared for the poor, he was a thief. Since he was in charge of the disciples' money, he often stole some from him for himself. So that's what's really going on here, is Judas is mad that he didn't get access to the money. A couple of lessons that we can learn just in passing from Judas's negative example, and generally Judas is a negative example in the Bible. Whatever Judas does, do the opposite. So just a couple of things to notice. Christian ministries do need to guard against greed and corruption. Okay, it's sad that this is going on here, and it's sad that sometimes that continues to go on. And we do guard diligently against greed and corruption. And then number 2 is Christians must refuse to disguise selfishness as righteousness. See, if you hang around within religious circles for long enough, you can learn to speak the language in such a way that you can say something that sounds really righteous, but you're just disguising your own selfishness. So that's all I'll say on that. Now, what's really interesting, talking about Judas, is Matthew tells this story as well. Mark tells it, Matthew tells it as well. John, Mark, and Matthew all tell it. Matthew, when he tells this story, immediately after this altercation, he has Judas going out, finding the religious leaders and saying, "What do you give me for Jesus?" It's like Matthew, by the way he arranges the story, is highlighting it to us that Judas in this moment realizes Jesus is worth more to me dead than alive. Why am I wasting my time following him around, skimming a few coins off the top of the purse when I could just cash in and cash out? So for Judas, although he hides his concern in righteous language, it's too much. He thinks Mary's adoration is too much. It would have been better if she put that money in the purse that Judas himself carries. So that's Judas. Next up comes Jesus, and Jesus is going to sort of interpret what Mary has done here. And so it says, Jesus says, "Leave her alone. She did this in preparation for my burial. You will not always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me." Wait, did I say that wrong? "You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me." So you may have a couple of questions immediately having heard Jesus say that. Number one, how could Jesus be so callous about the poor? And number two, what is he talking about when he talks about burial? So let's talk about those two questions, okay? Number one, is Jesus just completely disregarding the plight of the poor? Does Jesus not care about the poor? If you studied the Gospels, I hope you can see that that's not the case for Jesus. Jesus told the rich young ruler to sell everything he had and give the money to the poor. Jesus taught that when people gave banquets, they should not just invite the influential and their friends and the popular people. They should invite the poor and the disabled and the outsiders. Jesus claimed that the Spirit of God had anointed him to come and bring good news to the poor. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, when you give to the poor, and then he gives instructions. He doesn't say if, he says when you give to the poor. Jesus is absolutely committed to relieving the suffering of the poor and empowering the poor. And so should his followers be. That's not what's going on here. Jesus isn't saying the plight of the poor isn't important. He's just saying, look, there's a particular urgency here because these are my last few days. There will be time to take care of the poor, and you should absolutely take care of the poor. And that's important. Something's happening right now that is even more important and even more urgent. Which kind of leads us to the other question. What does Jesus mean when he talks about his burial? In the ancient Near East, it was customary when someone died that they would apply spices and perfume to the body before burial to guard against stench. And so it was common to use myrrh and like frankincense and myrrh, aloe, and guess what? Nard. So burial rituals were a really important, they weren't the only use for nard, but they were a really important thing that nard perfume was used for. Now Jesus, for a while now, has been signaling he knows he's going to die soon. He knows the end is near for him, and so he interprets Mary's actions and says, she's getting me ready for the grave. And he's right. Because given the way that they handled in that culture, that they handled laundry and bathing, and given the quantity and the strength of this perfume, we can imagine that probably for all of Holy Week, this smell would have lingered on Jesus. That as Jesus rides into Jerusalem, as he has the Last Supper, as he washes his disciples' feet, as he is betrayed in the garden, as he's arrested and put on trial and beaten and crucified, this smell would have lingered on him. And the custom was to wash a body before you buried it. And so some of it might have gotten washed off. But it's likely that at least some of it remained even when Jesus was buried. And so Jesus is actually right. She's perfuming his body for burial. It's death and burial week for Jesus, and she's getting him ready. Which raises the question, does Mary know that's what she's doing? Does Mary somehow know that in 6 days, Jesus is going to die, and so she's walking into that room thinking, I'm going to preemptively perfume him for burial? Which, by the way, even back then, would be a weird thing to do. Some scholars think that that's the case, that she actually knows he's going to die, and that's why she's doing this. Personally, I don't think so. And I'll give you 2 reasons. Number one, if you read the story of the Last Supper, which happens just hours before Jesus' actual death, and it happens with the 12 disciples, the closest followers of Jesus, the inner circle. Jesus says, I'm going to die, and they are shocked. And so if they don't get it, it seems unlikely that Mary would have figured it out ahead of time. And then the other reason is that there's a pattern in the Gospel of John where people say things or do things that mean more than they know. And we saw that last week where Caiaphas, without knowing it, prophesied that Jesus would die for all humankind. People say or do things in John's Gospel that mean more than they know. And I think that's what's happening here. That she's not walking in thinking, I'm preparing him for burial. She's doing something that means more than she knows. So if that's the case, then what does she think she's doing? I'll tell you later. Let's just quickly look at the last 2 groups of people. We have the crowd in the last couple verses. We have the crowd and the religious leaders. So it says, when all the people heard of Jesus' arrival, they flocked to see him and also to see Lazarus, the man Jesus had raised from the dead. Then the leading priests decided to kill Lazarus too, for it was because of him that many of the people had deserted them and believed in Jesus. And so you have the crowd. You have the people who flocked to see Jesus. And for them, Jesus is interesting, okay? There's this buzz around Jesus, this spectacle, this enthusiasm. Jesus is trending. Okay, word is spreading. Did you hear that this rabbi raised a man from the dead in Bethany? He's back in Bethany. We should go see him. And so they're really enthusiastic about Jesus right now. They're really interested. And the next day, they're going to be shouting, Jesus is going to ride into Jerusalem on a donkey, and they'll be shouting, blessings to the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Hail to the King of Israel. They'll be so excited, and they'll be shouting that, and they'll be shouting Hosanna, which means God's going to save us. And a few days after that, they're going to be shouting, crucify him. And then there's the Jewish priests. We also see them here in these verses. Of course, there's been conflict with them throughout the Gospel of John. They've already decided to arrest and kill Jesus, but here they also they decide that we need to arrest and kill Lazarus too, because Lazarus' story is making people turn to Jesus and away from our little religious industrial complex. So, Mary, Judas, Jesus, crowd, priests. What is Jesus worth? We are constantly making priority judgments as we live our lives. We're constantly calculating what's more important than what's worth more than what. What is Jesus worth? In this passage, you can see what Jesus is worth to everyone. So in the case of the religious establishment, Jesus is worth killing. Like, they're willing to kill so that Jesus will be gone. And so far they've indicated they're willing to kill 2 people so that Jesus will be gone. To the crowds, Jesus is worth passing interest. He's worth checking out. He's worth keeping an eye on. Because he's the talk of the town. People say he hands out free food, he heals the sick, he raises the dead, and he just might overthrow Roman oppression. He's worth keeping an eye on. He's worth passing interest. To Judas, we know exactly what Jesus is worth. In this passage, Judas, in his heart, is betraying Jesus for a shot at 300 denarii. And immediately after this story, Judas will actually betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, which is equal to about 100 denarii, in case you were wondering. For Judas, Jesus is worth cashing in on. And then there's Mary. And Mary brings costly, scandalous worship. To Mary, unlike everyone else, Jesus is worth bringing the best she can. Sacrificing, financially in this case, sacrificing in order to bring the best she can, and sacrificing her reputation as she brings it to him in a scandalous, uninhibited, unrestrained way. So, why the difference? Why is it different for Mary? Earlier, I mentioned that I don't think Mary thinks she's anointing Jesus for his burial. So what does Mary think she's doing right here? And I think she just thinks she's worshiping him. She's just expressing her deep love and gratitude to this Savior with whom she is absolutely enthralled. See, months ago, she sat at his feet, ignoring everyone else, and listened to him speak because she was so captivated. Now it's at a whole other level because just a few weeks before this story, Mary had to prepare another man's body for burial using a large amount of spikenard perfume. It was Lazarus' body. And he wasn't going to die. He was dead. And the custom in that day was to bury people quickly after they died. And so perhaps an hour after Lazarus had said his last words to Mary, she was perfuming his body with this spikenard perfume. And perhaps 2 hours after that, he was in his tomb. And then Jesus had walked into town while she was in the moment of her greatest sorrow. He had taken a moment to weep with her. He had led her to her brother's tomb and then miraculously gave her her brother back. That's John chapter 11. Why did Mary choose nard for Jesus? Why do you think Mary chose nard for Jesus? We don't know, but my theory is this. Mary had anointed Lazarus' body with this nard perfume. And that would have been the dominant smell as they buried him, as they put him in the tomb. Jesus came in John 11 and he said, roll the stone aside, open the tomb. And Martha had protested and said, he's been dead for 4 days, it's going to stink. But Jesus insisted. And as they rolled the stone aside, instead of the expected smell of rotting flesh, what smell came out of that tomb? It was the nard. It would have been the nard perfume. Jesus shouted, "Lazarus, come out!" And John tells us that Lazarus walked out, still wearing his grave clothes, which would have been soaked in the nard perfume. And so, all of a sudden, that smell has a different connection in Mary's mind. In a culture where this was the perfume of funerals, the smell of funerals, the smell of putting your brother in the grave, for Mary, all of a sudden, this perfume is the smell of new life. This perfume is the smell of tears turning to laughter. This is the smell of getting her brother back. This is the smell of death being conquered. See, on the one hand, this is burial oil, but on the other hand, this is resurrection oil. And so when she pours it on Jesus, yes, she's honoring him with this great luxury to smell good in a bad-smelling world, but she's also recalling the memory, the joy, the beauty, the paradigm-shifting, world-shaking reality of that moment when they rolled away the stone and they didn't smell death, they smelled life. They smelled that strong, sweet, spicy perfume. I'm the worst person to have as your secret Santa. Out of my whole family, I'm the worst. So we do Christmas lists, and what I'm going to do if I have your name for Secret Santa is I'm going to look at your list, and there will be gifts that I don't think are interesting, and so I'll be like, that's stupid, not going to buy you that. And I'll just not, and whatever's left, whatever gift I think is best, that's what I'm going to buy you. I'm not a good gift giver. My wife, Justine, is the opposite. Okay, she's the one you want. You want her to draw your name. She's someone who will think about who you are and what you like. Sometimes she doesn't even need to look at your list, okay, because she knows who you are and she thinks, okay, what gift would encapsulate who this person is? And I think that's what Mary's doing here. She's thinking what gift would encapsulate who Jesus is. And so it's like she's saying, remember that time we smelled death being defeated? Jesus, that's your fragrance. Jesus, that's what you should smell like all the time. And of course, she's saying much, much more than she knows because she's looking back toward Lazarus, but also it's looking forward to another day when death would be defeated. Let's wrap up. What is Jesus worth to you? Maybe like the religious leaders, you're hostile to Jesus. You'd rather have him gone because he's encroaching on your territory. He's walking around like he's in charge when you want to be in charge. Maybe like the crowd, you're checking Jesus out because you've heard of some benefits, but if benefits he offers, but if he doesn't deliver the way you want him to deliver, you're out of there. You'll turn against him. Maybe like Judas, you've got a relationship with Jesus, but you'd sell him out for the right price. And maybe 100 times a day, in small ways, you do sell him out. Remember, when we're talking about worth, we're really only talking about priorities. But maybe, like Mary and unlike the religious leaders and the crowd and Judas, you've smelled the sweet fragrance of Jesus bringing life where there was only death. Maybe you've rolled away the stone in your life, and where you thought where once there was shame, there was now acceptance. Where once there was bitterness, there's now forgiveness. Where once there was sin, there's now goodness. Where once there was lies, there's truth. Where once there was anxiety, there's trust. Where once there was alienation, there was reconciliation. If you're a Christian, that's your story. And if you're not, that can be your story today. Worship team, why don't you make your way up? I have a saying. I like to say that Jesus is either worth nothing or he's worth everything. Jesus is either worth nothing or he's worth everything. Because either Jesus was one of thousands of peasants who got on the wrong side of the authorities and was executed and really makes no difference to us, or he's the creator, the redeemer, the Son of God, and if that's who he is, then he's worth more than 30 pieces of silver or a year's wages. He's worth more than just coming to church and now and then and half-heartedly singing. He's worth more than praying quickly before the meal while you're eyeballing the chicken wings. He's worth more than saying you believe in him but never speaking of it. He's worth more than having an unread Bible on your bookshelf. And he's worth more than speaking his name while you work hard to build a comfortable, normal, middle-class life. If Jesus is who he says he is, if Jesus is who Mary experienced and responded to, then he's worth everything. Jesus is either worth nothing or everything. And the invitation to all of us is the same invitation that Mary responds to live all of our lives as acts of costly, scandalous worship. So that's our challenge for today. So I'll close with Romans 12:1, and then we'll go straight into singing. Paul writes, "And so, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all he has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind he will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship him." Why don't we stand as we respond in song?